area that has so many memories, good, bad, and indifferent, for me. And an honor to be at a session which is discussing such a wide variety of subjects, dealing with working class culture, identity, and political roles in this country. And I want to take up just one angle of those many, many things that are being discussed here in the time that we have today. Most of our best discussions of working class life have focused on localism, on communities, on workplaces, where people lived, where they worked. Because there we could see the realities of the relationships and the thinking and the action in which people were engaged. But I want to go to the other extreme today. And I want to think about the global context, especially since globalization is used constantly in our vocabulary today and used as though it's something new. I want us to think about some of the role that empire and imperial power have played in shaping working class life, hopes, aspirations, and fate over the course of the last 100 years or so. As if we just start out looking around 1900, we find the globe has been thoroughly carved up into imperial domains of one great European or North American power and another. The empires were of two basic kinds. There were those that you might call the old territorial contiguous empires, like Russia, and indeed the United States was one. The United States fits both categories, in fact. Countries that had spread across huge areas with many, many different peoples in them and ruled them from a single center in those years. The other kind, of course, were the colonial empires, built by overseas conquest. And as I say, the U.S. fit both categories by 1900. It was indeed a informal empire at its heart, to use the wonderful phrase that William Appleman Williams came up with. And those informal empires, those with very few specific colonies, are worth thinking about because it's become the model for every imperial power today. I'm going to follow up on that kind of example of ruling without directly administering control of the domain in which you find yourself. The U.S. then concentrated its attention, as of 1900, especially on the Western Hemisphere, because of American direct overseas investment. About 50% was in Latin America, and almost all of that in Mexico, as a matter of fact, and about 35% in Canada. The rest of the world was relatively small potatoes on the direct marketplace of American overseas power as of 1900. This country had just conquered, in a war with Spain, the Philippines, of course, Puerto Rico, in effect, mastery of Cuba, which it tried to master ever since any have ever been to Cuba, and been in that magnificent harbor of Havana, where any kind of a fleet could hide from the world and shelter from the storms. And you realize why every great power in the world wanted their hands on that. That was right at the keystone of the arch of control of everything around it. So the U.S. didn't annex Cuba, it promised not to, but it gained, in effect, power to intervene whenever it wished in Cuban affairs coming out of that War of 1898. The U.S. empire, though, depended basically on this combination of economic power exercised above all, to say, in the Western Hemisphere, exercised so effectively that Secretary of State Richard Olney had said in 1895 in his classic words, "The United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law on subjects to which it confines its interposition." Here's a clear declaration of who controls what on this side of the world. But the control also went through military power. Because there's one thing when you always hear about market economies today. Markets historically have been built basically by military force. And there's no such thing as having economic access to a country without the use of political and military power to open that. And certainly you think of how the history of China and India are written, especially as almost subtext on that line of the role of military power in opening up the way to trade and control. And the U.S. military power was a great reserve power to control the debts, the financial policies, basically through, when necessary, the landing of the Marines. And think just of the term of Woodrow Wilson. We just added a few little colonies in Woodrow Wilson's time. The Danish Virgin Islands were next to the United States. But the informal empire, the Marines into Santo Domingo, into Nicaragua, into Mexico, and above all into Haiti, which became virtually a colony of the United States from 1916 to 1934, in which we had to put down a massive rebellion, because I'll come back to this subject. One of the crucial things that went along with imperialism the world over in that age was forced labor. The empires that took economic control needed modern transportation systems to get the goods that they were extracting out of those countries. And somebody had to build those railroads, somebody had to build those wharves, somebody had to make these new connections, and this was the forced labor that was put upon the residents of that area. And the Haitians rose in revolution against forced labor in 1918. And at least 10,000 were killed by the Marines in putting down the rising of that year. This was the informal empire. Nobody ever said Haiti was a colony. Clearly, the military power to control the economy of that area was every bit there. And as I suggested, in speaking about this world imperial system and the role of the U.S. in it, the colonies were, in the unforgettable phrase of W.B. Du Bois, the slums of the world. The contrast between the steady rising of incomes in the great industrial powers and the stagnant or even declining incomes elsewhere in the world was one of the most remarkable features of the 20th century and a real key to the dynamics of that.